Hey, thanks for tuning in for another week for the Albert Tate podcast. So excited that you're tuned in. Hope you've been enjoying this season. I know I've been having an amazing time. This week, we've got David Kinnaman in the waiting room with us as we talk about his work with the Barna Group, the great work that they do, his new book. You got to check that out. And we talk about his own experience while being in the waiting room. It's one you don't want to miss. Check it out. Thanks so much for tuning in. Always like, share, subscribe. Let's go. Check it out. Here it is, Albert Tate Podcast and David Kinnaman. Hey, thanks so much. Another week, Albert Tate Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you've been enjoying the waiting room. I hope you've enjoyed my guests in the waiting room. It's pretty cool to hear these amazing leaders talk about the times and moments that they've experienced, they themselves, in hard places of waiting. Today, I've got invited into the waiting room David Kinnaman. He runs a great organization, research organization named Barna, the Barna Group organization. They've produced tons of great content, got an amazing book that just released, and he's going to talk about his book. And then we're going to talk about time in the waiting room and how that impacted him. And let me tell you something. David's experienced some moments in the waiting room and has gotten some great nuggets for us to learn from about what he learned when he was in the waiting room. So, get comfortable. Here's my conversation in the waiting room with Barna Group's own David Kinnaman. I am so excited today to have David Kinnaman. David, thank you so much for joining the Albert Tate Podcast, bro.
My pleasure. Thank you, Albert.
David runs the Barna Group. Tell us a little bit about the Barna Group and what you guys do over there, bro.
So Barna's been in business since 1984, started by a good friend of mine, a boss and mentor, George Barna, in 1984. And we do social research to try to understand what's happening spiritually and across a range of different sort of demographics and psychographics in our culture. And so we've come alongside some of the biggest organizations and ministries and leaders to try to help them understand, what's happening. And we use social research to do that. And so we've written books and articles and, a bunch of PowerPoint slides and data that try to help people and leaders really get a sense of what's going on in the world through the lens of research.
Wow, that's exciting. Now, David, that sounds like it has the potential to sound like a boring job because you're just doing research and reading all the time. What inspires you and why are you passionate about that?
Well, there can be some boring elements of it, but I think the devil's in the details, and the kind of work that we do really matters. I can tell you so many different stories of coming alongside organizations and leaders at critical times in their either organizational life or their leadership, journey, and being able to use research to help them discern what they should do, their right next step. And, so often we're stuck without a clear view of what's really happening. We sometimes use these anecdotes around us or our gut, and those are okay, but they're not always as good as doing good, solid research. The things that fire me up are trying to help reconnect a generation to the church. Millennials, Gen Z, they're struggling in so many ways with the form and the function of church. And so we've done tons of research on that. I've done at least 3 books on that. Unchristian, You Lost Me, and a new book called Faith for Exiles. And, really trying to help reconnect the young people to the church. Another thing is really trying to help, leaders of churches to have a new scorecard for success. We count, people in the church, the number of dollars that are given, nickels and noses, as people say, but we don't always do a good job of understanding how we're helping them to flourish as human beings. And so, can we help leaders sort of understand the deeper story that is happening in the midst of their leadership? Those are the kinds of things that fire me up.
Oh, man. And I'm just going to tell you, the product of some of that boring research has been a huge blessing to our church and to me personally. Good Faith was something that once I read it, man, I stopped the whole staff. We all sat down and read it and had several conversations just talking through the implications. So it's shaped many of our next steps. So we really appreciate the work that you guys do. It's been a blessing to our church. Tell me about the latest product that you guys got, the latest book, Faith for Exiles.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for saying all that. I mean, it's a privilege to be able to come alongside leaders like you and your staff, and when we get a chance to present, the data to leaders or help to open up their eyes to a changing world. It's what drives us. So there's all the boring work of working through the surveys and all the rest, which for those of us that are nerds and geeks and researchers, it's not boring. Actually, like, the time flies. So the new project is a book called Faith for Exiles. And I'll just sort of mention sort of two projects at once because they go hand in glove. And one is Faith for Exiles, which is an end to a trilogy of books on the next generation that I've written. And so it went from You Lost Me, focusing on non-Christians, Unchristian, focusing on non-Christians, You Lost Me, focusing on lapsed Christians, and then Faith for Exiles, which is focusing on the most resilient young Christians.
Wow.
And so we've focused in on the 10% who are the most resilient. And then the second project that we worked on that's sort of related is the thing called the Connected Generation, which we did with World Vision. And it's a global study, 25 countries, 9 languages, more than 15,000 interviews, where we interviewed, 18 to 35-year-olds. And a lot of the things I've been studying for the last decade in Unchristian, You Lost Me, and Faith for Exiles is now in this book called The Connected Generation. So we've been really trying to understand the heartbeat of this emerging generation, what they're thinking about faith, and how we as church leaders can really make a difference in their lives.
What's been the biggest, aha discovery in the research with understanding this next generation? Everyone has opinions about millennials and the Gen Zs and all of this stuff. What's been a couple of just the big whoa, we didn't expect that out of the research?
That was really surprising is just the level of anxiety and mental health issues that this generation is dealing with globally. So that was certainly one of the big findings. And the conclusion is that this generation needs the church to be emotionally connected. And what we mean by that is, we've huge levels of anxiety, depression, mental health. 1 in 5 adults around the country, young adults around the country and around the world, are fearful of violence, which is just a huge number when you think about, the millions of young people in these 25 countries that represented. And so to be a connected church means we have to emotionally connected. We have to think about the long-term impact of what we communicate, how we communicate, what we're doing, how we're shaping our events, how we think about interacting with people. And here's an example. We see in a lot of the work the last 10 years that a lot of those who walk away from the church or walk away from their faith feel as though they were emotionally manipulated into making a decision for Christ. Now, that's not true of everyone, and it's okay to use emotions as part of our communication toolkit. But I would say that we have to be really cautious not to have people look back on that time when they raised their hand, when they made a commitment to Christ in those early days, that they're like, wow, what was that? Was that a cult? Was I just being religiously and emotionally manipulated? And instead, that this is why, I believe God transforms the whole person, our heart, mind, body, and soul, and that our ministries have to be effective on that as well. So in addition to, a heart commitment, we also have to train the mind and think about the ways in which this is going to, be emotionally connected into their world and into their life. As you're preaching and communicating, thinking clearly about and asking the Holy Spirit to come alongside you to say things that might allow for those in your audience who are going through a different experience. This summer I was at a church where the pastor was preaching about taste and see that the Lord is good in the Psalms, and she acknowledged, the pastor did, those times when for some people, you've gone through cancer, you've gone through circumstances, and for me and for my kids, who we've gone through a tough time with cancer with my wife, who's doing really well now, but it's still the pain and the wounds are pretty deep. The fact that she acknowledged some of those things in her teaching gave us space to really wrestle with what she was saying about taste and see that the Lord is good. So emotionally connected church has a whole range of different implications, but that was one of the big things, the levels of anxiety, the pressures that the most connected generation of all time is feeling, and how the church can respond to help develop, people of peace is really, really profound, I think.
Wow, that's pretty that's pretty amazing. And when you say that, I immediately identify it. When I think about the mental illness issues, the depression, the suicide rate, and all of those things that are happening, and it seems as if we're not careful, the church would kind of ignore those things and not be intentional about reaching out and identifying and creating space for those things to be dealt with and brought before the cross. And how does Jesus show up in that space? So that's very profound and very helpful as a leader, teacher, and as a church.
Yeah, thanks. And I think one of the implications of that is that, simply trying to preach our way through those issues isn't really sufficient. It's more important than ever to be a good preacher, but it's insufficient to bring around the kind of emotional connection and issues that people are wrestling with. And, kind of a related finding is just the level of cynicism that this generation often has towards authority figures. And that could be people, government leaders, even the industries that are the most well regarded, like technology and healthcare. Well, healthcare isn't particularly well regarded, but like even places where we know we're going to have to engage in the political sphere or with various industries, people in general, and in particular when it comes to the church, we find that there's a growing level of cynicism that a church could be emotionally connected to the real issues of the day. That like all you do as a pastor is, you're basically paid. You're paid to be the God guy in the room, and so. I think we as leaders have to admit and understand that we are conflicted as professional Christians. And what that means is, of course, we really believe this stuff, although we know that from the data about 1 in 4 pastors say they go through a period during ministry when they significantly doubt whether God really exists. And that's like, I'm surprised it's not 100%, right? Because it's tough to be in ministry, and it's tough to be human and not have some just honest doubts and questions. And the more that we make it okay and understand that the more it's norm. We normalize it for the rest of us who really are dealing with those questions. But if we're just paying people to be professional Christians, and we're not clear about how this generation, if all they hear at your church are people who are paid to be Christians speak and present, we're finding this reaction that they're like, well, that's just your job, man. You're just paid to be my friend. You're paid to be the God guy in the room. So, we can outsmart that, not just for strategy's sake, but we have this natural resource of, dozens, hundreds of people in our church who are lay Christians, who aren't paid, who aren't conflicted. We should do a good job of bringing them up front, praying with them, hearing from them, interviewing from them. They may not be teachers, but doing more and more of sort of platforming them, because I think it helps to diminish the sense of millennials and Gen Z, like, oh yeah, that'd be youth pastor. Like that guy's just part of the church marketing department, And so we got to do a good job of sort of recovering this priesthood of all believers theology that we all believe.
Yeah. A lot of our folks that are listening this season, we've been in conversations deeply about what I call the waiting room, and it kind of goes along with what you're talking about, creating space to have real, authentic conversations about hard times that people can identify with. Waiting room is this place that we find ourselves in when we're following Jesus, and we don't get to dictate the times and the seasons. And when suffering comes or hardship comes, we find ourselves stuck in a place where we're waiting on God. And to be honest, a lot of times that's when people walk away from God. When something hard comes along and they don't trust God to bring them through it, they're actually frustrated, or they blame God for that season. So with the Barna Group, before you buy it, you're a vice president, kind of, first of all, what gives you the ambition to take it over and the confidence? Because there are people that are listening right now that want to do something big, but questioning whether they even have the goods. Is there a thing like maybe you shouldn't have bought Barna? Maybe you should have. Are you just made to be a junior vice president? How did you know that you had what it took to go after it and to have that ambition? And some people would even look at that as arrogance or pridefulness, or who do you think you are? How do you fight those things in culture?
Yeah, those are good questions, Albert. it was weird because when I first started thinking about, buying a company, I was actually really more thinking about trying to understand the next 10 years of my work with George. I've been working with him for 14 freaking years. And I learned so much. I really, in some ways, didn't realize how much I was ready to move on. But I remember saying, like, in my mind, as I started to think about the negotiation with him, and he was really clear that he's like, you're gonna be the next leader of this company, and my wife and I, Nancy Barn and I, are planning on that being the case. And so, but he didn't really have like a succession plan. So I started thinking, okay, well, what would that look like? I mean, I think I want to run this thing, but I had, certainly plenty of doubts and plenty of questions in my mind. And so I started, sort of scenario planning around, well, okay, well, maybe if I could just earn, a couple percentage points a year of equity in the business over a period of 20 years, I might earn like 30%, 30% of the business. But I was still, like, in my mind thinking about how I could serve and just work alongside him. I really loved working for him. He's a great guy and a courageous leader. And yet it was almost as though I had to buy a majority over the period of time. Like, the Lord, one of the principles I learned was that promotion comes from the Lord. So the more you are trying to promote yourself, the more that like there has to be periods of time where you in Abraham's case, like, you're really willing to sort of sacrifice your idol, your dream, your son. And actually, just as a side note, I mean, I've had to go through that even in the last 10 years. I mean, this week, October 1st is my 10-year anniversary of owning the company. And so even in those 10 years, I've had to give the company to the Lord at regular times, talking to, even being in submission to my family and advisors. Like, if I'm trying to pursue this for my own sake, then it's time to walk away. And I've structured a lot of things around myself that keep me in sort of a submitted relationship about, the timing of my calling here. But yeah, those were tough decisions. And I mean, like, I finally started to realize that in order to move the company forward, I had to own the company. I had to own a majority of it. I had to, and then I still kept George and Nancy as a minority owner, because I want to make sure that I honor them, that if we could experience any kind of economic growth or long-term viability, that I wanted to have them, have a stake in that as well. And so it was really interesting, those periods of, realizing that the Lord was asking me to step up and lead, and what that sort of that journey personally of, that I wasn't just supposed to be a second in command, but I was supposed to be a second generation leader, a leader who came after and stood on the shoulders of George.
Yeah. What I love about that, man, is one of the big lessons that promotion comes from the Lord. And what you learn in the waiting room, you oftentimes have to then execute again on the playing field. So it's not like you had to trust God to promote you in that one season. But I love that you said even since running the company, you've had to go back and reuse those muscles. So and engage that muscle memory of surrender and yielding as you lead the company as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it was interesting too. We, the first year in, we had a big embezzlement and, don't talk about this too much publicly, but it's like just the nature of business. Sometimes things happen, and it's not like you throw up your hands like, well, it just happened, but it was painful lesson.
Wow.
And it was enough money that it was really, an existential threat to the business. And so it was about 12 months on from buying the business, about 9 years ago. And I remember in a weird way, it felt like my business for the first time, that I, I was sort of determined in my heart to save the business and to make it through the tough time, and the clarity of communication and the crisis management, and, two words that I never wished I knew, went together: forensic accounting. Where you literally you hire someone to figure out where did all the money go and how much was it, and what kind of actions do you need to take to recover it or to make good. And the Lord did restore a lot of that, and again, it was like this really important set of lessons early on. Even a little bit of another waiting room for me of the several months as we tried to rally, talk to vendors and accounts receivable and talk to people we were paying, accounts payable, and like going through all of our just how do we get through this, and we did, we made it. It was like a huge deal that we made it through. And so again, I think I learned a lot of important lessons about running the company around trust but verify kind of stuff, and just a whole range of things that were important at that time as well.
So you would say that waiting room taught you a lot of business lessons that you would glean from for the years coming after that, pretty significantly.
Absolutely. And, again, part of it was this interesting loneliness of leadership. And I don't know that sometimes you might describe it as, sort of like nobody else but me. And I had lots of people around me who helped us get through it.
Yeah.
And people who lent us money and people that, deferred payments and, just we made it through. But it was sort of like, how do you hold a vision in your heart and a vision to get through that? And because we're a small company, people think Barn is massive, and we're a well-established brand, and we do just fine. But it was like we've gone through highs and lows in the natural business cycles of what we've done, and so having to learn some of those lessons and how to communicate through a crisis and how to deal with different layers of the business, and just to be patient in that, and again to kind of hold a long-term vision, is meant. There were such valuable lessons that have been things I've come back to time and again.
And I hope that's encouraging to the people that are listening that find themselves with ambition and wanting to go to the next level, or navigating business or navigating leadership, but you find yourself in these difficult waiting rooms, that they are filled with rich lessons. The waiting room is often a classroom where there are rich lessons that are being taught, and how to identify them. And you look back 5 years, 6 years, 10 years later and say, whoa, most of what I've learned came from the waiting room. As you mentioned briefly, and I'm just so thankful for the testimony of your wife and that she's doing well. As you guys have walked through that for a couple of years, man, what are some of the biggest takeaways as you guys sit and hold one another and reflect and are so thankful for where you are now? What are a couple of things? You already said that God doesn't waste suffering, which is powerful. T.D. Jakes has a famous quote, "God doesn't waste pain," and I just absolutely think that's so significant. But any other takeaways or lessons from that season? I definitely don't want you to relive that or talk through all of that, because I can only imagine how traumatic that was. But any lessons coming out of that waiting room?
Well, we were just finishing up our kitchen remodel when all that came down. It was about a 6-month kitchen remodel. We did a beautiful kitchen remodel that we've been waiting for 20-something years. So, Jill says that it was because of the kitchen remodel that all this brain cancer stuff happened. No, I'm just kidding. But it was a waiting room of its own kind, doing the dishes in the garage.
Bro, yeah. Well, let me tell you something. I was talking to you during that time, and I started a kitchen remodel after that, and we're right in like month 5 of a kitchen remodel. So I feel the pain, brother. I feel like I'm in a waiting room. Can I come to your house and cook on your kitchen, please, while we wait?
Absolutely. Anytime.
Oh man.
That's why I mentioned it. But yeah, so I don't know. It is such a painful period of time, and I say that because I think it's so easy for us as leaders who process life, who try to put meaning to circumstances. I did a lot of journaling. I it was another period of time, as I mentioned, where I thought a lot about what the Lord might be calling me to do in terms of vocation. That like caring for Jill, could be part of my vocation, but also part of, that I was open to any kind of, promotion or change in status at that time, and also feeling like the Lord wasn't, asking me to become her full-time caregiver. We ended up hiring some full-time care and other things during those. She's better now and doing, like I said, quite well. Although there's still sort of this long shadow of, the impact of that, just memory and just things, and so there's been some real gifts that it was almost like there's things gained and things lost. We've lost a lot. We've lost a lot of innocence. She's 43 years old when it came. So, it's sort of like people aren't supposed to get sick that early, but they do. And we've lost a lot. We've also gained a lot. And among that I've gained is just I've got a 20-year-old, 18-year-old, and 15-year-old son, 2 girls and a boy. And I think there's no way that I would be as close to them today, and in the way that I'm close to them, had we not gone through this. I mean, they give me advice and emotional intimacy, and there are 2 of them off at college, but we talk with regularity. And the beauty of cell phones is that we're able to stay connected. I probably get 3-4 calls a day from my oldest, and we don't talk long each time, but just like
wow,
or every time, but we we're just like we're pals, and she's a champion for me and my emotional health and my spiritual health. And, so that's one thing that I've gained. I've gone to see a spiritual director the last year and a half, and that's been another thing I've gained that, like, while I'm always interested in growing and, growing as a leader, I think a lot of the first 20 years of my leadership were around, just sort of like this sense of being up and to the right. Like, you're just kind of like growing like a weed, but then a lot of this was really thinking back, I think as Richard Rohr says, sort of the other half of life, like, you're trying to not just backfill, but you just realize like, this isn't the way life is. Life is not going to just be, writing books, doing speaking, being successful, quote, perceived to be successful, whatever. It's like, there's like a whole other side of life. So it's made me incredibly aware of what others are going through. And I still have so much room to grow in that, but, just realizing how much people are suffering around me. You just think today at the hospital, the closest hospital to you, there are people who are just in immense physical pain and emotional anguish. And, the world is sort of filled with suffering, but when we're not in that mode, we don't tend to tap into it. We don't care. So it's just given me a new dimension of understanding, even the research we're doing, understanding what people suffer, and how the moments that lead to them taking one of our surveys is, sort of a story of what they've experienced and what they've suffered.
Yeah. Wow. I'm so thankful for you and allowing us to learn from those lessons. And the thing about your kids, man, and that relationship and that intimacy and that connection, that's so beautiful. And it's something that I think we all kind of long for. And it's interesting. The irony in that is that we think the more good we can give our kids, the more our relationship and the better quality relationship, toys, cars, phones, trips. But it was cancer that brought a level of intimacy that I'm sure you would say is irreplaceable and invaluable now. So the way that God works, it's frustrating at times because you're like, man, I wish I could have gotten that kind of intimacy from a new car. That would have been great. But it's like when you look back over
a trip to Hawaii,
you know what I'm saying? Yeah, that could have pulled it off, God. Exactly. That would have been cool. But to trust him and to rest in him and to see him make all things work together for good. recognizing that there's pain in that as well is the beautiful narrative that really God promised. I say all the time, when it comes to God, we're standing on promises oftentimes that he never really made. There will be suffering, there will be trials, but the promise is he'll be with you every step of the way through those trials and those dark times. So, man, David, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for how this story will then shape the work that you provide for us through the Barna Group. You're a blessing to the body of Christ, and man, you're a blessing to me. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us today.
Albert, always a pleasure, man. I love you, brother.
Love you too, bro. Thanks so much.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Albert Tate Podcast. To stay connected, make sure to subscribe to the Albert Tate channel, rate and review this episode, and make sure to share on your social media platforms. You can follow along with Albert on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Once again, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode, and we'll see you next time.